Well, welcome everyone. Um, Today it is my pleasure to introduce Sara Isgate. Tonight she's going to be presenting about problem solving in a changing world, how do eastern bluebirds respond to noise disturbance. Um, she has been awarded by PSO in the past for some research support from our organization, and I'm sure her research is supported by many others as well. She's a second year PhD student at Indiana University in the Roswell Lab. Her research explores the cognitive abilities of wild birds in the face of global change. She received her bachelor's degree from Albright College with a dual degree in biopsychology and digital media, and her master's in wildlife and fisheries science from Penn State. In the Kagi lab at Penn State, she studied the effects of noise pollution on problem solving in wild eastern bluebirds. Today, she will be talking about the history and methods of studying cognition and behavior in wild birds, presenting results from her master's thesis, and providing a sneak peek of the ongoing research she is performing at IU. Thank you so much for being with us, Sarah. This is all really cool stuff. I'm really looking forward to learning what you've been exploring, how we're pushing our knowledge of how birds think, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Joe, for that great introduction. I'm so excited to be here today. I love talking about my work, and hopefully, you guys get to learn some new stuff today. I sort of preface these talks by emphasizing like how much I've learned along with the birds as I study like how they learn and solve problems. So I'm excited to tell you a little bit about my work. So just to get started, I wanted to go over a couple more things about me and sort of how I got started in this work. So I grew up in Pennsylvania in a small rural area of Schuylkill County, so within the coal region of Northeast PA. And then when I went to college, I went to Albright College, which is a really small liberal arts school in Reading, which is in southern PA. And I got my degree in biopsychology and digital media with a focus on evolution and animal behavior. And I've always loved animals, growing up sort of in the country and always was really curious about animals' daily lives and knew that I wanted to go to school so that I could sort of peek into what drives their behavior. And I sort of continued this education when I started volunteering in wildlife rehabilitation, which started in 2021. And I really became interested at that point in the challenges that birds face, particularly those challenges caused by humans. So we see a lot of birds in wildlife rehab that are caught by cats or that are victims of window strikes. And that sort of encouraged me more to sort of understand how birds are mitigating those issues and challenges, especially as humans are ever present in their habitats. So at that point, I decided to go to grad school and get my master's degree, which I completed at Penn State. And in the Wildlife and Fisheries Science Department is where I sort of began this research, sort of looking into the problem solving abilities of birds. And I've continued that throughout my PhD. I'm now a second year at Indiana University. And throughout all of these experiences, I've gotten to explore so many different facets of bird behavior. So I've volunteered at Shavers Creek, which is a local Pennsylvania education center about 20 minutes away from the Penn State campus. I've worked with local Audubon Society chapters. I've given talks on local TV about my work and the cognition puzzles that I use to study bird behavior. I've done workshops with organizations like the Pennsylvania Game Commission to build nest boxes, continued to explore my interest in wildlife rehab, and then given talks at academic conferences as well. But overall, the sort of main driver behind my research is sort of studying how animals use problem solving, especially in a changing world that is affected by human presence. So we can understand a lot of different things by exploring this facet of animal behavior. So first and foremost, the human impacts that animals are experiencing in their daily lives as urban areas are expanding and wild habitats are sort of more fragmented or just outright destroyed. We can also learn about innovation in nature. So, how animals are innovating, how they are developing new behaviors or changing old ones in order to adapt to new things that they've maybe never experienced before in their environments. We can also look at their reproductive outcomes. So, how um, changes in the environment might be changing how animals are having young and what times they're having young and how their young are surviving in order to produce the next generation. And then also looking at environmental influences. So, climate change is also a big part of my research, and how increasingly warming global temperatures are also affecting birds' abilities to persist within their traditional ranges and perform species typical behaviors. So to sort of pinpoint more of these sort of human caused disturbances that affect the survival of wild animals, which I've done a lot of reading and thinking about throughout my graduate education. So as you know, humans are more present in wild habitats, you'll have things like reproductive failure. So animals who aren't able to bring their offspring up to a productive age. You also have territory shifting. So um, things like building of cities and extraction of natural resources will cause animals to shift their historic territories away from resource-rich areas, maybe to areas that aren't so great for collecting food and raising babies. You also have stress on the body. So things like increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, which ultimately can lead to decreased lifespan. And then also excess energy expenditure. So it's, difficult to do things like run from predators and run around trying to find food. And that becomes even more difficult when you're running away from things like human encroachment. And the focus that I decided to narrow in on during my master's research was noise disturbance. So, noise disturbance is consistently becoming more and more of an issue in wild habitats. And sort of the closer that animals get to noise disturbance is sort of going to determine what kind of effects they might have. So you can see sort of by this image on the right, um, that limit of audibility there and the arrows as you go from um, sort of farther to closer, you can have different responses like physiological stress. So that's things like I talked about with like increased heart rate. You can have something called masking, which is when a artificial noise source might cover up a noise that an animal might be relying on in order to survive, like a warning call or calls that are coming from its children. You'll have behavioral responses, which are things like running away or performing like non-typical behaviors, territory shifting, and then even injury. So noise can actually cause damage to the ears. So we have to be careful that, especially when noise is really close to an animal's environment, or where they're spending a lot of their time, that we're not actually causing like physical damage. Um, and one way that I sort of dove into during my time at Penn State that we are able to study how animals are dealing with these things is through the examination of animal cognition. So, if you're unfamiliar with the definition of cognition, it essentially refers to the ability to acquire and respond to information in the environment. So, that could include things like memory or learning, problem solving, sort of like anything that you're using your brain for in order to adapt to something that's going on around you. And one of the scientists that was somewhat famous in this field was a cognitive psychologist known as B.F. Skinner, and he worked a lot with pigeons in a laboratory environment and was able to display a phenomenon known as shaping. So here is a really cool video from B.F. Skinner's archives of two pigeons learning to play a game of ping pong. And while this is certainly not a species typical behavior, we're able to elicit things like this in a laboratory environment through shaping, which is sort of the gradual introduction of like little pieces of a task until an animal is able to perform a full complex behavior. So what that might look like in a game of ping pong is if a pigeon touches a ping pong ball, it will get rewarded with a piece of food. And then once it has that behavior down, maybe it has to like peck the ping pong ball across the table. And then once it's reliably able to do that, it'll get a treat. And sort of over time and over consistent reinforcement, usually with a food reward, animals are able to perform these really cool complex behaviors. And we're able to study this in a bunch of different ways. So scientists have been consistently coming up with new ways to study how learning can evolve in a laboratory environment. So there are a lot of different little tests that have been developed that sort of study different aspects of cognition. So to go over a couple of them, we have something known as detour reaching, which you can see here in the top left. So that would be sort of testing an animal's ability to learn to control their behavior by presenting them with a reward that isn't immediately accessible. So what usually that entails is putting some sort of food reward inside of a clear tube or behind a clear barrier so that the animal can see it but can't necessarily reach it unless it sort of takes a longer way around. It sort of goes around towards the end of the tube instead of trying to get, right through the impassable barrier. We've got motor learning next here on the top right, which is sort of involves an animal's ability to move things around in the environment. A popular way to do this is something that's known as a lid flipping task. So there will be a bunch of lids on a little grid with compartments underneath, and maybe some of those compartments reliably contain a food reward. So the animal will sort of need to learn to flip those lids over in order to access that food reward. Related to motor learning, we've got spatial memory, so on the bottom left there, and that sort of deals with an animal's ability to learn and then remember where rewards are consistently in a specific location. So, for example, in this diagram, maybe it would be only in the bottom right corner would be a food reward. And when you present this test, over time, you're sort of looking at that animal's ability to ignore those other three lids and only flip that one where it has remembered the specific location of a food reward in the past. And we can also look at color association, which is an animal's ability to differentiate between two colors. So maybe between dark blue and light blue, and only the dark blue lids have food underneath. And you'd be able to present this again over time and see if the animal sort of connects the dots that, okay, only the dark blue is going to contain a food reward. And all of these tests are sort of designed to be relevant to skills that animals might need to be good at in the wild. So for color association, for example, an animal might need to understand the difference between two similar but detectably different shades of red when determining like if a berry is poisonous or if it's going to be a nutritious food. And then like for spatial memory, an animal might need to remember the location of a specific food source, like a specific plant, and where that might be in a vast crowded forest. And these tasks are easy to control in a laboratory environment, but we also need to have ways to study it in the wild as well. So scientists have sort of more recently begun to develop methods for studying this in the wild and being able to integrate variables that can be consistently observed to understand what sort of, besides simply learning, might go into an animal's ability to behave differently in these different situations. And one really cool thing that I've incorporated into my research is studying animal personality. So, like humans, animals have what we could call personalities, which are sort of adjacent behavioral differences among individuals, similar to what humans have, that are relatively stable over time and across contexts. So you might have seen this perhaps in your own backyard. If you've got bird feeders or nest boxes in your own backyard, you might see that animals, even in the same species, might consistently have observable personalities. So you might have some birds that spend like a lot of time on the nest box, regardless of if you walk past or like if you're out the window looking at them. So they have like high nest box activity where they're like constantly in and out of the nest box and they're like very, very engaged. And then you might have others that are a little bit more skittish or fearful, which we would refer to as having like a higher neophobia, which is like a fear of new things, especially to things that are new in nature. So those birds might be a little flighty every time they see a person, especially birds that are used to more like naturalistic habitats. So you can definitely observe this in animals in the wild. Um, and how all of this sort of came together in my master's research was I wanted to understand if we were to look at these things in a wild species, looking at a anthropogenic or human disturbance factor that is common. um, I wanted to understand how a noise disturbance might affect the ability for eastern bluebirds to perform problem-solving tasks. Um, so eastern bluebirds, obviously a beloved backyard bird, and I'm sure those of you who are avid birders know all about the eastern bluebird, but I'll give you a couple of quick facts. So as far as habitat, they prefer open fields near trees. They prefer sparse ground cover, which relates to how they feed. So their feeding behavior is typically consisted of a perching and swooping method so that they can find insects on the ground. So you might see them perched on a fence post or a wire, sort of scanning the grass and looking around to see if they can find the bug and then sort of swooping down and catching it in their beak. They do face several challenges in their native habitat. So things like invasive species, because they are cavity nesters, meaning they nest inside of a hole. You've got things like starlings and house sparrows, which are encroaching into these historic territories and are often out competing bluebirds or interfering with their nesting attempts, such as like poking holes in their eggs. You've got also a loss of farmland. So, farmland, especially one that might be more of an edge habitat close to forest, might be a really ideal habitat for a bluebird. But as these habitats are sort of going away from historical territories where farmland has existed for years, bluebirds are experiencing habitat loss. And then also pesticides. So, pesticides that are designed to kill insects on plants. Insects are primarily what bluebirds are going to be eating in the summertime. So application of pesticides is a big issue for these birds. And then just a little bit about their population history. So in the early 20th century, their population actually declined nearly 90% due to things like habitat loss. But then in the mid 60s, efforts sort of came together to increase the presence of things like bluebird trails and nest box installations in public parks and people's yards. And between 1966 and 2019, when data was last collected, their population has actually increased about 2.4% per year. So they're actually making a really great recovery thanks to nest box efforts. However, we know that noise disturbance does have effects on things like parental care. So one of the first students to investigate this in my lab group at Penn State was a scientist by the name of Danielle Williams. And she essentially did an experiment where she exposed nesting bluebirds to a chronic noise disturbance of gas compressor recordings. So the gas compressor recordings were taken from a natural gas extraction site. So if you're familiar with fracking, these natural gas compressors have this like low rumbling, sort of like constant, very like low frequency noise that can be kind of disturbing in these habitats that are preferred by bluebirds. And what she found was that when exposed to chronic noise, bluebirds spent less time incubating their eggs, which is really important in order to ensure those eggs are going to hatch and be successful. So we wanted to sort of understand this a little further, especially because when you look at the literature and you look at things that other scientists have done, there has been some investigation of how this noise can relate to things like cognition as well. So, in laboratory studies, when exposed to traffic noise, laboratory birds, in this case, the zebra finch, performed worse on a detour reaching task, a motor learning task, and a spatial memory task. So as you can see by those red lines on those bar graphs, they had more failures and they took longer to solve these tasks when they were exposed to recordings of traffic noise. So just like cars going by, which is something that birds might hear on a regular basis and we might not think are affecting them, but it might be interfering with their ability to exhibit these problem solving behaviors. And birds are actually exhibiting problem-solving behaviors all around us, and we might not even notice it. So there are lots of cool historic examples of birds exhibiting problem-solving in nature. So one of the famous examples is out of the great tit, which is a bird that lives in Europe, but is related to our chickadees, like black-capped chickadees that live in Pennsylvania. So back when milkmen used to deliver milk bottles to people's doors, these birds learned how to sort of like use their beak as a plier and sort of like rip the tops off of these milk bottles in order to access the milk inside. So that's one of the famous historic examples of birds sort of using problem solving in a human dominated world. But there's a lot of really cool videos that you can look around on YouTube and you can find birds using uh, automatic doors to gain access to like convenience stores, or you might have seen, house sparrows flying around inside of like big box stores. So they've learned that they can sort of fly in front of an automatic door sensor to like open automatic doors. And then corvids are famously known to sort of perch above busy intersections and drop nuts into roadways and sort of wait for cars to like roll over the nut and crack it. So birds are always sort of, coming up with these behaviors. But perhaps we're not paying enough attention to it, which is where, these scientists come in to understand ways that we can study cognition in the wild in a more scientific way. So one of the earliest instances of this in the literature was in 2002. A group of Japanese researchers devised a puzzle box, sort of similar to the ones that were used in the lab as far back as the 50s by B.F. Skinner. And they targeted this behavioral test at wild pigeons in the middle of a city. So what happened was this box had a button and a food dispensing apparatus on it. So pigeons could essentially approach the box of their own volition and free will. They weren't, forced to interact with them. They weren't caught and put in a lab environment. They're just free living pigeons out on the street. And if they were to press this button with their beak, a food pellet would sort of come out of this little square box underneath the button. And what they found was that without any shaping or training, birds would participate in this task. So they didn't need to necessarily, do any kind of training for these birds, and they would just sort of by chance, approach this box and learn that they could reliably get food out of this apparatus. And they could even change the settings so that birds had to peck up to 40 times for a single food reward, and they would still do it. So that sort of just reinforces this idea that animals can learn to sort of anticipate a result based on a specific behavior that they can perform. And since 2002, we've learned that there are really cool ways to take advantage of technology to help us study cognition. So there have been labs that have studied color association. So putting devices out in the wild and encouraging birds to peck a specific color in order to get a food reward. And then there are also tests that we can use to assess spatial memory. So putting these automatic feeder devices out in the wild and encouraging birds to go to these different feeders, which are only accessible if you program them to open based on radio frequency data that is collected from leg bands. So we can actually band these birds with these little leg bands, as you can see on that chickadee. It's a little pink band on the leg there. And there are radio tags inside these bands that are programmable to interact with these electronic feeder devices so that that little door that the chickadee is getting that seed out of will only open if it recognizes a specific bird's leg. So these birds can essentially learn, which feeders are reliably giving them access to food and which feeders aren't. And it's a really cool way to use technology to our advantage to sort of observe these birds in their natural habitats. However, these designs can be expensive and they do use like complicated electronic mechanisms and they do rely on food motivation, which is notoriously difficult to quantify in the wild because we don't really know unless we, follow birds around all day, like when they last ate. So it's essential to be able to use other forms of motivation in order to encourage these wild birds to participate in testing. So we've discovered that by taking advantage of cavity nesting birds, so birds that can nest inside of nest boxes, that we can leverage the desire to provide parental care to encourage them to participate in cognition testing. So birds can pull a little string, for example, that is affixed to a door at their nest box in order to remove a barrier and go inside the box to feed babies inside of the box. Or they can perch on a lever that is connected to an obstructive door. And sort of by that perching motion, the door is removed from the nest box hole and the bird can go inside to feed hungry babies. And these are two examples that were first developed in European species, but before my own research, there weren't really any examples of puzzles such as this in American species. So my advisor, Jason Kagi, and I developed the idea that we could do a lever puzzle design for use in American nest boxing species. So we chose the eastern bluebird because of its tendency to use that perch and wait style of feeding. We figured that it would be naturally inclined to perch on a lever and then be able to get inside the nest box in order to feed babies. And that's exactly what we did. So these little babies here are about 12 days old, and you can see they have those big yellow mouths when they open their mouths to beg. That's a very attractive signal for parent bluebirds to want to put food inside of those hungry babies' mouths. And at this point, they have to eat every about like 10 to 15 minutes, or they will beg to eat every 10 to 15 minutes. And these parents can essentially land on that little lever there, which is connected to a pulley device on the back of this wooden flap that goes on the front of the nest box that is attached to that door there. And by perching and applying weight to that lever, they're able to get inside the box, and they are pretty good at it. So after some initial pilot testing of about 5 pairs, being able to determine that the bluebirds can do this, we decided to launch a full-scale experiment. So things that were really helpful in setting up for that experiment was being able to band those birds. So I mentioned bands before. We did not use fancy radio frequency bands, but we did use government issued metal bands, which are standard issue bands that are provided by the Department of the Interior for researchers to be able to keep track of birds. And then we also had color bands so that we could sight individuals through binoculars to be able to keep track of the birds in our population. And that was a really useful and valuable thing that we used to sight the birds as they were solving these puzzles. And another thing that was a really great resource was my field site, which is the Russell E. Larson Agricultural Research Center, which is about a 20-minute drive from the Penn State campus in State College, Pennsylvania. So it's a sprawling farmland habitat. So you can see an aerial view of it in the large picture, in which we had 54 nest boxes, all placed about 40 meters apart, where we performed this study. So to talk a little bit about the experimental setup, as I mentioned, the nestlings inside the boxes motivated the parent participation in this study. So we had to perform the study during the breeding season, which was approximately between May and early August. And this was in the summer of 2023. And then in order to make sure that these parents weren't too wary of these puzzle devices, we didn't want to elicit that neophobia, as I mentioned, that fear of like a brand new thing, like a puzzle device being on their box. We actually devised these things called dummy devices to aid in their ability to sort of habituate to something new being on their nest box. So it was essentially a wooden flap that sort of looked like our lever puzzle, but didn't have that obstructive door, and both levers were static and stable so that they could perch on them and sort of go freely in and out of the box without having to worry about, any sort of puzzle solving mechanism. And these were placed on the boxes before we deployed our actual puzzle devices. And then as far as our noise treatment, again, we used gas compressor recordings, and we used the same recordings that were originally played in that 2021 chronic noise experiment. But for this experiment, we were only really interested in looking at the exposure to noise during problem solving. So in this experiment, the noise was only deployed for a short amount of time via these large speakers that were placed about 1 meter behind the nest box during these trials. And then again, the puzzle device itself, these birds had to sit on the lever in order to enter the nest box. And importantly, there are 2 levers on the box, and only one lever is going to let them in. So for this example, that lever is there on the left. And that sort of elicits sort of that spatial memory. It's like a combination of like a spatial memory and a motor learning type of task for these birds to solve. So a little bit more about the experimental timeline in detail. So a week before our trials started, we would monitor our nest boxes daily in order to determine accurate ages for our chicks. So we wanted to make sure that all of the chicks were the same age when we would deploy our puzzle devices at the nest box. So we would just check on them every day between day 0 and day 9 post hatching. Then when the chicks were 10 days old, it was the day before cognition trials would start. And this is when we would put up our little dummy device. So you can see a picture of it there. It's that wooden thing on the front of the box. So the 2 levers there are static and there is no obstructive door. And we would also begin our noise treatment. So our speaker is under that weather shield there on the ground in that picture in order to protect it from rain and various weather elements. Then the next day, on what we will refer to as trial day 1, the babies are 11 days old, and we begin our puzzle trial. So we put the puzzle device on the box for an hour, and we don't want to put it on for any longer than that because we don't want the babies to go hungry. So they are perfectly okay to be in the box for an hour, and if the parents don't solve the task, we take it down after the hour is over and put the dummy device back on the box. And then on trial day 2, which is the next day, the babies are 12 days old, and we repeat the puzzle task one more time, putting that puzzle on the box for an hour. And then after that hour, the puzzle device is removed and the noise is turned off from the site. And being able to do this test 2 days in a row allows us to observe the effects of learning. So once the birds can be exposed to this task for multiple days to see if they get any faster at it on the second day. And we're also able to record activity because all of these trials are filmed on video. So we're able to watch those videos and then sort of score the behaviors and record the times that things are happening in order to get a better picture of what's going on in us during puzzles. So to get into my results, we found that out of the 44 bluebirds that we test, which is 22 pairs, a male and a female, 23 out of the 44 birds overall solved the task after 2 days. So that's around a 50% solve rate. And we found that noise and silent solve rates were about equal. So you can see there for the noise, it was exactly equal. We had 11 and 11 for failures and solvers. And then for silent, we had 9 failed and 13 solves. And when you run statistics on it, it's not significantly different. So it's still around the same on average. And the acute noise presence in their environment didn't seem to affect their ability to be able to solve. Um, I did mention that one of our interests was to be able to assess learning by looking at their problem solving scores over time. And we did find that birds solved faster on day 2 of testing. So you can see there that that second bar on day 2 is shorter, meaning that it took them less time to solve that task on day 2. So they are providing evidence that they're learning and able to get in quicker on that second day. We also examined the effects of personality and how personality relates to problem solving. So we're able to look at how these birds are reacting to the task specifically on day 1. So the first time they are exposed to the puzzle device, we found that those that solved essentially took less time to first touch the box, suggesting that they might be a little less neophobic, so a little less afraid of that new thing being on their box. And then we also found that those that solved spent more time overall interacting with that box. So that green solver bar being higher, being larger, is reflecting that those birds spent cumulatively more time, so greater amount of seconds, actually physically involved with the puzzle or the next box during testing. We also found some interesting interaction effects between noise and day, especially on personality characteristics. So while noise didn't affect their deterministic ability to solve overall, we did find that in our silent group, birds approached a little bit quicker on day 2 of testing, but the opposite was true in our noise group. So during the noise, the birds took longer to approach on day 2. So this could mean that the noise sort of continuing throughout these 2 days of testing could be a little bit of a disturbing factor enough to affect that time to first touch, but not necessarily enough to affect solving overall. We also found an interesting effect of sex. So across both days, we found that female bluebirds were more active than males on both days of testing. So you can see a graph there for day 1 and day 2. The females cumulatively spent more time at the box, and we think that it could be related to the fact that females sort of invest more reproductive energy into the babies than the males. So they're the only ones to obviously lay the eggs, but then also to incubate the eggs as well. So while both parents are feeding, those females are the ones that are investing more time in sort of the lead up to these birds being at the point where they're 12 days old. So it could be that fact that encourages them to be more active during this puzzle task. So in summary, we found that bluebirds are robust despite a short-term anthropogenic noise disturbance. So again, the key here that was different from the original Williams study was that the noise was short-term. So it only lasted during those 2 days of testing and did not necessarily affect the ability of the bluebirds to solve the task. We also found that birds were able to innovate during a new challenge in the wild. So again, we're always looking for ways as scientists to be able to study animals in their natural habitat in sort of a way that is as least invasive as possible. And we're able to see that these birds are able to perform really cool new behaviors, like perching on a lever to enter a flap. And they come back year after year. So the study was performed in the summer of 2023. And before I left Pennsylvania to move to Indiana for my PhD, I went out with some undergrads to the field site and was able to see birds that were involved in this experiment that had come back the summer of 2024. So that also gives us good peace of mind that these types of tests aren't necessarily invasive in nature and that the birds are able to remain resilient. And a question that I'm really interested in as my research moves forward is how other environmental conditions that are sort of related to human disturbance, but are more broad in context might be affecting birds' abilities to innovate and to problem solve. So the question that I'm investigating now in my lab at Indiana is how heat is affecting cognitive performance in the tree swallow. So the tree swallow is a similar cavity nesting bird, and we are specifically interested in looking at how rising temperatures are affecting problem solving in the wild in this species. So I used the same differential choice lever puzzle in the tree swallow in the first field season here this past summer at IU in my tree swallows. And I also devised a new test, so a detour reaching barrier that can be deployed at the nest box. So you can see there by that little clear flap to see if these birds are able to sort of route around that flap and go into the nest box. So I was able to deploy both puzzles this past field season to test the tree swallows. And I'll give you a little sneak peek of the data that I've gleaned from these experiments so far. Um, but first, a little bit about the tree swallow, if you're not familiar. Also a cavity nesting bird, but slightly different from the bluebird in several ways. So as far as habitat, they do prefer more marshes, wooded swamps, and wet meadows. So they rely a little bit more on reliable access to water than bluebirds necessarily do. They also have different feeding behavior. So instead of that sit and wait and swoop down strategy, they are aerial insectivores that catch bugs right out of the air. So they spend about 80% of their day in active flight and are able to just like zoom around and catch mosquitoes and dragonflies right in their beaks and return them to the nest box to feed their babies. As far as challenges in their natural habitat, they are susceptible to parasites. So a lot of tree swallow nestlings will have feather mites, which they're very, very prone to. They're also very vulnerable to wetland degradation, things like water pollution, chemical pollution of the water. And then they're also very sensitive to cold snaps. So these birds migrate down to the southern areas of the United States, the Caribbean, and South America in the winter, and then return to nesting sites across the contiguous United States in the spring and summer. But if they return too early, sometimes they are susceptible to cold snaps, which can prove fatal for them if there are not enough bugs in the environment for them to sustain themselves. And then, unlike bluebirds, they are actually in active decline. So declining about 2.3% in total population numbers since 1966, largely due to habitat loss. But interestingly, they are expanding their breeding range southward despite rising temperatures. So each of the past 3 summers has been hotter than the one before it on average. And we're really interested in how these birds are able to still persist in these environments despite sort of rapid and urgent effects of global warming. And again, to give a little brief overview of how these tests went over the summer, which I performed across a range of different temperatures and a range of different times of day. This first summer, I was really mostly interested, however, in how these birds just responded to the tests in general. So being able to deploy 2 different tests, I found that different tests provided different challenges. So we'll talk about the detour first, which is that little clear flap that goes right in front of the nest box hole that they have to fly around. I tested 33 pairs, so 66 individuals, and I found that overall 46 out of the 66 swallows were able to solve this detour puzzle. So pretty good. That's over a 50% solve rate. However, the lever puzzle was a lot more difficult for them. So only two out of my 66 birds were able to solve this lever puzzle, which I found really surprising because, they're both cavity nesting birds. They're both nesting in the same size nest boxes. However, I think from these behaviors that I observed during lever puzzle activity, during these videos that I filmed, these birds, because of their different feeding strategy, because they are not sit and wait type birds, they are less inclined to sort of want to sit on that lever um, compared to a bluebird. So they were doing all kinds of innovative things, but not so much sitting on the lever. So I found these birds trying to, for example, squeeze through ventilation gaps in the nest box. There were also issues with the door not opening wide enough because tree swallows are smaller and lighter than bluebirds. Landing on the wrong lever because it's a little bit more stable, and then doing a lot of clinging to the closed door. So sometimes in science we have these failures, but we learn from our failures and we come back with more information than we had. So even though these tree swallows did not solve the lever puzzle, we were still able to compare their behavioral patterns between the tests. So, for example, some behaviors were similar and some behaviors were different when we looked at the same sort of things across the detour and the lever tests. So, for example, we found differences in the time that it took for the subjects to first touch in the detour and the lever puzzle. So the subjects actually took longer to first touch that lever puzzle, which could suggest that they were a little bit more apprehensive towards that lever device being on the nest box as opposed to that simple clear flap of the detour. However, when we look at their cumulative activity, we actually see that it was fairly similar. So they spent, even though they didn't solve that lever puzzle, they still spent around the same time trying and interacting with that box as they did with the detour puzzle, which is sort of speaking, I think, to their level of resilience, that even this puzzle that's not necessarily aligned with their natural history and their feeding physicality, they were still determined to, interact with it and try to solve it. So I've definitely learned a lot overall as I've continued through this journey of investigating bird problem solving. And some final thoughts that I'll leave you with as we near the end of this presentation. Measuring cognition has been so helpful in, for my own research and for science as, at large, at helping us understand how birds are able to innovate and come up with those new behaviors as the world continues to change. But devising new techniques is vital in helping us understand more species, even those that may seem similar are different in very specific and important ways, and making sure that our puzzles align and sort of work with the natural tendencies of species is only going to provide better insights into strategies that they're using in their natural environments, using their natural behaviors. And then birds are facing challenges every day in the wild. It's hard to exist as a wild bird. There are lots of different, things that they have to deal with, even without scientists running around in their natural habitat. But there are definitely things that we can do to help. So I talk about this slide when I look back on my first field season of bluebird testing in 2023. That first picture there is myself and my undergraduate assistant, Caitlin Honus. We're putting up and repairing our nest boxes, and it's during one of those notorious cold snaps. And it's below freezing in that picture as we're trying to put this nest box up, and there's already bluebirds out on the field site. So dealing with unexpected weather is something that birds are dealing with every year more and more. They also deal with predation. So as you can see here, this nest box was predated by a raccoon. And through these experiences, I've learned how absolutely important it is to protect your nest boxes with things like predator guards and baffles. That is vital for being able to sustain these bird populations that rely and benefit so heavily from man-made nest boxes, um, and is able to sort of give them a helping hand towards being able to survive things like predation from predators. They're also dealing with, other birds in their environment. So this third picture here, a little video of a northern mockingbird, which landed on one of the nest boxes during puzzle testing that I was able to catch on video. And while a mockingbird isn't necessarily a threat per se to a bluebird, it's not, a predator. They are notorious for, perching atop of high places and singing their love songs for all to hear. And that father bluebird is responding accordingly by kicking that mockingbird out of the territory, which requires energy. These birds don't have boundless, endless energy. So dealing with things like this is, a source of could be a source of stress and a source of unnecessary energy expenditure. And then again, I will highlight in that fourth picture the prevalence of invasive species. So here is a picture of some bluebird eggs that were sabotaged by a house sparrow who had pecked holes in the eggs. So that is another thing that birds are increasingly having to deal with as well, is the threat of invasive species. But there are things, as I mentioned, that we can definitely do to help birds and mitigate these challenges and help scientists understand more and more what challenges birds are facing in the wild. So I will reiterate one thing that people can do to help cavity nesting birds is install nest boxes with baffles. So making sure that you have a stovepipe baffle on the nest boxes if you're putting them up in your backyard, that will deter predators from being able to climb these poles. That is so monumentally important for increasing the likelihood of baby birds to reach fledging and encourage their survival. There's also a ton of community science opportunities that are available to the public. So Cornell, Cornell Lab of Ornithology has a ton of different programs. Two that I will highlight are Project Nestwatch, which you can go to the Cornell website and search Project Nestwatch, and you can actually take an online quiz and a course to learn how to be a better nest box steward and a better steward of wild bird behavior. And then, of course, I'll highlight eBird as well, which is an amazing resource that scientists glean data from as people can report their observations as they are out birding. And that data helps with a ton of different research projects and is really just fun for the public to be involved with, to record where you've seen, historic locations of birds, maybe for the first time. I know I love going out birding and recording new species that I've never seen before. And as I travel through grad school and get the opportunity to see new birds in new places, that's always really fun. And it's really a win-win for the scientific community. And then also just keeping in mind to respect sensitive life history periods of birds. So while I learned from my research that birds are very robust to short-term changes, such as, noise being exposed in the environment for, 2 days, we learned from Danielle's research that if disturbance is chronic, such as gas compressor noise being, put out in the environment for the whole breeding season, that does produce, things like lessened incubation time. So we have to remember that, especially, when birds are coming back from migration or feeding young babies at the nest box, to make sure that we're just being mindful of their space and not, disturbing them as they're just trying to exist in the wild. So with that, I would like to thank all of the organizations and people that have helped me across my scientific career. Of course, the Pennsylvania Society for Ornithology for their funding to be able to make this project possible, Penn State's Department of Ecosystem Science and Management, and then a bunch of different sources of funding for my research at IU, including my advisor's NSF grant, my local Audubon chapter. I use Research and Teaching Preserve and our Center for Integrated Study of Animal Behavior here at IU, and of course, my undergraduate technicians and my amazing advisors that helped make this research possible as well. Thank you so much.
Sweet. Thank you, Sarah.
Mhm.
We
Yes.
were if we were all collected in one room, this is when we would all give our little applause. Um, we have uh a couple questions from Ellen and
Of
everybody
course.
else who might like to. Feel free to give a whirl on the question and answer place. You can also use it for comments as well. I'll give Sarah a moment to start to look at things, but I guess I can be the read aloud for Ellen's first question. So she said for the lever puzzle in tree swallows, was it set to open with the lower weight of the bird? Did you measure the difference between landing on the correct lever but opening versus not opening?
Yeah, the way that I tried to pilot test this in the lab was by filling a sock, like a little pantyhose, with sand that was approximately the weight of a tree swallow, which seemed to work in a pilot testing lab setting, but sometimes between pilot testing things in the lab and actually putting the puzzle out there for the tree swallows to interact with, it's not always a one-to-one comparison. So most of the birds that did land on the lever, though very few of them did, were able to open the door. But in that one instance, I had to highlight the door just like didn't open wide enough for that poor pair, and they were so determined. I felt so bad, but that's just sort of the nature of pilot testing these DIY puzzle devices. So yeah.
But even if you had made it an even lighter mechanism, fewer of them were landing on it to pop it
Yeah,
open than the
they just
bluebirds.
really, they really did not want to. I quantified like how many times they landed on the lever, and it was a lot less than the bluebirds just even like touching it. So
Yeah,
just really do not, because they're so aerial. And I think that's why they did so well at the detour, because you just have to fly around that flap, like they don't have to land on anything.
cool. So Ellen has another, I think, related question. Do tree swallows naturally use bird feeders if available since they are aerial feeders? Why did you select tree swallows as your bird of choice rather than a different bird that uses a more similar perch and insect snatch to bluebirds?
Yeah, tree swallows, yeah, they don't really come to bird feeders because of their, aerial insectivore sort of feeding style. So they're like less common to see as like a backyard bird because I know people will put, mealworm feeders out for bluebirds and you can consistently get bluebirds feeding in bird feeders at your yard. But um the scientific community is really interested in being able to sort of work with the natural history of a wide variety of species. So just because, a bird might not necessarily have a specific feeding style doesn't necessarily mean that we're not interested in studying how it responds to, challenges in the environment. So being able to adapt our tools and our methods to birds with different natural history characteristics is really important.
Sweet. And then after Mike's compliments,
Thank you.
also we're we're young in the tree swallow box at the time of the experiment. If so, how long before the barrier was removed so the parents could access the box?
Yeah, so the young being inside the box is a key part of what encourages the wild birds to participate in testing, and all puzzles are only left up on the box for an hour at a time. So it's really it's enough time for us to evaluate a period of problem solving effort without being too long to have any like health consequences for the babies. So they're perfectly fine to go, 60 minutes without a feeding event. And we are available at the box the whole time during testing to make sure that like nothing gets, knocked down, to like cover the hole after testing and making sure that like when we take the puzzle down, we stay an extra couple minutes at the box to make sure the parents are coming back and going in afterward to feed the babies.
Cool. And then Ellen says, do you have another type of puzzle that would be more suitable for a tree swallow?
Yes, I've been trying to brainstorm how I could still study sort of like a spatial memory paradigm in a tree swallow. And I thought that what I could do instead of a lever is sort of have a false front on the box that maybe has multiple entrance holes in it. and only have one that's actually the real entrance, and the rest just have like plastic, like a clear plastic, so that they can like stick their head in and like have to learn like, okay, this one is like I can't get through, but maybe like the one in the top right is like the real one, and be able to film those trials and see over time if they're able to like use that spatial memory to be like, okay, it's always that one in the top right, because they were so attracted, as you might have seen in my slide, about what they did do at the lever box with that gap at the top. So they're really attracted to like holes, gaps, cavities. So trying to use that to my advantage to study their spatial memory.
Cool. And then Alyssa actually asked what I was going to ask if she hadn't. Is there a puzzle that bluebirds can figure out but house sparrows can't? Would love to see a mechanism to protect them.
Oh, I should have put, so I put this puzzle out when I was studying my bluebirds at Penn State, and try as we might, there are so many house sparrows out that are like near like buildings out at this farm site, less so in the like agricultural field section, but anything that's close to a building will have house sparrow activity, and the house sparrows are excellent at solving this puzzle. Even like they cheat at it. They will land on the static lever and like flip the door open with their nose. So they're even, I would say, even more innovative than the bluebirds. So that is sort of the dream, to have some sort of like exclusion device that, native species can solve, but invasive species can't. But it's definitely difficult because they're invasive for a reason, and that's often because they're so good at innovating. They're good at
Yeah.
living in places they didn't evolve in.
Yeah, they're a human-made box specialist
Yes, they're
by
just
the greatest degree.
they can nest in anything.
Yeah. And it doesn't surprise me that the pigeons are good at some of the complex tasks of
Mm-hmm.
human stuff
Yep.
for similar
Yep.
stuff. They've been by our side for 10,000 plus years
They
now.
have. Yep.
Um so yeah, Janine says an observation I've seen when putting house sparrow excluders on bluebird nest boxes, I've observed they will figure it out over time. Any comments or thoughts? I guess we've been there.
Yeah, that's, sort of what I was saying about the puzzles as well. Like they figure out the puzzle very quick too, like the lever puzzle. And they're very adaptable, and they've got, I would say, like very low neophobia. So seeing a new thing for them, like they're not, even like sparrow spooker devices. Like if you put shiny things or like strings in front of the hole, I feel like they eventually just don't care after a while. And the best thing that we can do, as unfortunate as it is like try to like exclude them when we can. And I see a comment below this talking about, dispatching non-native species is hard and a lot of people don't like it. Have you had any luck with it? So one thing that we do in the Roswell lab is we apply oil to the eggs of house sparrows. So if we see like house sparrow eggs in any of our nest boxes, if you apply like olive oil, just like regular household olive oil, it actually coats the pores of the egg that gas exchange occurs through. And if you coat it in oil, the eggs just won't hatch. And it can be a little bit more effective than just like removing the whole nest, because this house sparrow will retaliate. So if a native bird moves into that nest box, sometimes the house sparrow will kill it. So by like oiling the eggs, we can sort of like make sure that the eggs aren't going to hatch. And then when the parent goes into the nest box to like incubate the eggs, we can like set a trap and like remove the parent and humanely euthanize the house sparrow. So that's how we sort of handle it, from a conservation perspective. And yeah.
All right. And on a more uplifting note, Alex has a great final question. What was your favorite, proudest moment over these projects?
Oh man, I have really loved the mentorship opportunities I've gotten to introduce new students to this field. I've worked with a lot of undergraduates, and I've got to go to different conferences like around the country. In January, I was in Portland, Oregon, presenting this research at a national conference, and I was able to take an undergrad student with me for them to present their research for the first time. And it's just been really great getting to share this research with people that are, just beginning in their careers, and and also communicating it to audiences too. I think people are really excited about, learning about the secret lives of animals and the things that they can do that they're doing this in our own backyards and we aren't aware of it. So I think that that's really been really rewarding for me.
Well, thanks for bringing some of that to us too.
Yeah.
And fascinating material. I wish you the best. And you know, I really do look forward to the day long in the future when this field has come so much further. I feel like there's going to be so many more like opportunities for cool, like intentionally designed interactions with animals that are going to be good for conservation. And
Yeah.
more proactive, beneficial stuff is going to be ahead of us following this work in the many dimensions of potential application. So
Hmm.
I'm
Hmm.
I'm grateful for you and all of your colleagues who are pushing this field.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm excited too, and I'm just starting my career as well. I've been doing this for a couple years now, but I'm so excited to continue it in my graduate education and to learn more and develop new tests and test more species in similar ways. And I think the sky's the limit. So excited to keep going.
Sweet. Cool. Well, thank you everyone in the audience for all of the interesting questions and interactions, and just having you here makes all the outreach valuable. So thanks to you all as well, and good night.
Thank you guys.
Bye.